How's it going, everybody? This is the Uncanny Omar from Near Mint Condition, the home of collected editions, and I have the pleasure of talking to Scott Dunbier today. And you may be familiar with a lot of his work. I know I've highlighted a lot of his work over the years here on the channel, and it is an absolute pleasure to get to talk to him. I'm a big fan, and I know a lot of my viewers are big fans. But just in case you've never heard of Scott Dunbier, Scott, who are you? What do you do?
Well, Omar, first, thank you very much for having me on. And I'm a fan of yours also. I always enjoy the coverage you give my books and other books.
Well, I appreciate that.
My background is I grew up in New York. I was a comic book fan, a comic art fan since I was a little kid. I lived on 87th and 2nd in New York, and I went to school at PS 190, which was a school that was on 82nd between 1st and 2nd, and right between my house or my apartment and my school was a early comic shop called Super Snipe. And so I started going there when I was a kid, and they remarkably had an original art gallery at that shop. And so that's where I saw my first artwork, and I became very enamored with it, and I eventually started selling original art, and then in the mid 90s, after a few years, Jim Lee had offered me a job at Wildstorm, and I turned him down a few times because it was kind of nebulous. There wasn't any real idea of what I would do, but finally I said yes in 1995, and I went out there, and I wound up becoming an editor, and I became editor-in-chief of Wildstorm back in 1996. Then we were sold to DC. Excuse me. And then I became executive editor, and then I left DC and I went to IDW in 2008, and I've been there ever since.
Wow, that's a long journey. Now, how did Jim Lee find you? Just out of curiosity, how did that connection happen?
He just looked in the yellow pages. No, just kidding. Jim and I were friends.
Okay.
We met in 1987 or 1988, and I never sold his art, but we were friends, and we used to hang out. If I would come out to the West Coast or he would come to New York, we'd go out and get dinner and play pool and stuff like that. And then he was always a fan of comic art, and he would call up and we would talk about different artists that he was looking at. And eventually I think the year after they started, maybe in 1992, he asked me to come out, and I said, well, what would I do? And he said, we'll figure it out. And I said no, and then he asked me again, and I said no, and then finally he had an idea, which I wound up not being a part of really, or a very small part of, and then somehow I became an editor, and that's it. The rest is history.
Which you're helping to curate and make it more accessible to people. This is such a really amazing project. Before we go any further, though, I do want to thank Greg Katzman for helping us get together and talk about this. He's a good guy. He's over at IDW, and he's been a heck of a guy to work with.
Absolutely.
Okay, so you had me at original art, and I cannot even imagine, I'm not going to ask the year, what kind of original art you saw at that store. That is so cool.
I can tell you, the first piece I remember was a Neil Adams page. They had an exhibit in the early 70s, and I remember the comic shop was on 2nd Avenue. The gallery was on 84th, right around the corner. Both of them were tiny, but they connected through the back.
Okay.
The first thing I noticed was, being a Neil Adams fan when I was a kid, was a Batman page from, and don't ask me how I remember this, Batman 237. And it was Batman walking like a full figure of Batman walking in front of a bunch of people at a costume party. Marvel and DC characters were part of the page, and that's the first original I remember seeing.
Man, that's awesome. And for some reason, that just stayed with you.
Oh yeah.
I'm almost scared to ask how much pieces like that were going for back then, because we're talking about that era. I can't even imagine what it would go for now.
You know what? I was 9 years old. I wasn't, I certainly didn't have the money to buy it. It was, probably a couple $100.
Couple $100. Wow. And then that stuck with you so much that you decided to start selling original art. So I have to ask this question, because this is an area that I've always been really fascinated with, but I'm not familiar that much. And that is, how does one even acquire these things? Like, do you call the artist? Do you call the editors? Do you call the inker, the penciler? Or is it somebody that had original art or family?
Well, back then it was pretty much, I think, the same as it is now. You go to the artist and you buy art from them. I mean, that's what I would do. I would buy art from either collectors or the artists, whether they be the pencilers, the inkers, whomever. Yeah, pretty much the same as it is now. It's a lot easier now because, back then, I had to track down artists, and being in New York, it was a lot easier. Most artists at that point were in New York.
Mm-hmm.
It was very different pre-internet. It was very difficult to be able to buy. It was very difficult if you were an artist to be in the business if you were outside of New York.
Okay, and now it's a lot easier with the internet and everything. So, how did you take all that knowledge, and then how did the concept for these artist editions first come about?
It's interesting. There were sort of two main paths to it for me. One was I used to be a member of a comic art APA. Which, are you familiar with APAs?
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
Well, there's a comic art APA, and I was a member of it. And there was an issue devoted to Neal Adams, and as I said, he was my favorite artist when I was a kid. Mm-hmm. And I used to own a bunch of Neal Adams original art, and I did an interview with Neal for the APA, and I also wanted to contribute, as people do in these things, showing original art that I had. Several pieces were in pencil, and I would make photocopies, and they looked terrible. They just looked awful. And so I decided to try to make color photocopies, and they looked really good.
Okay.
And I wound up making, when you're a member of the APA, you have to make 60 copies of your contribution. So I had this big contribution, and a number of pages were in color. And so back then, color copies were much more expensive than they are now. So I spent literally hundreds of dollars on that. But I also realized that original art looked much better if you shot the art in color. And then the second inspiration was a few years later when I was at Wildstorm, and Chip Kidd had come out with a book on collecting Batman stuff. And he had a couple of pages, or one page, from Batman 251, which is the famous Joker issue. And coincidentally, I used to own that page 10 years earlier. But so Chip had it photographed, and it looked like nothing I'd ever seen. You could see the blue pencil, you could see the gradients in the inks. And so that was the sort of the refining moment of it. And then I pitched it to DC, and they passed on it.
Okay.
When I went to IDW, I told Ted Adams about my idea, fully expecting him to say he wasn't interested. And then I would have just published it on my own because of the agreement that I had with Ted, and that he allowed me to do things outside if they turned things down. But he said yes, and so that was it. We were off and running. The first book was The Rocketeer.
Man, that's awesome. Like, and I've always wanted to see how these things are done too, and about acquiring the artwork. And there's some great questions in the chat right now, but these are more my personal just questions here. When you're looking at, I mean, because if you're not familiar with these books, by the way, they're a good size. They're wonderful, big, beautiful books. And what Scott and his team do is mimic the dimensions of an. Let me see if I can hold this up. Of an artist, like art page. So my question is, like, we'll just use this for as an example, the Don Rosa Artist Edition. How do you get the original pages? Like, is there a scanner? Do people mail in their original art and they have to sign something, or you have to sign some kind of, I mean, there's got to be some kind of insurance in case something happens, right? If things are being mailed in, like original art, or do you all send a scanner or ask them to scan these themselves? Like, how does that work?
We don't really mail artwork very much anymore because of the cost. We used to have an insurance rider, but it's, values of art are way beyond those anymore. So what I prefer to do is scan everything myself. And I, as an example, a few years ago, before the Todd McFarlane book came out, I flew back east. My son Alex came along with me, and we flew to Washington, D.C. on, I think, Thursday. And then that night, we drove down to South Carolina. There's a collector there with a ton of McFarlane art. And we set up, and I scanned the art in my hotel room over the course of a day.
Mm-hmm.
And then I drove that next night back to Washington, where I met another collector and I scanned his art. And then the next day I drove to New Jersey and I scanned art for a different book. And then there was also a comic art show that weekend, so I went there.
Mm-hmm.
And then I flew back. I drove back to Washington with my son, and I flew back, maybe on Monday. And, over the course of Thursday to Monday, I drove 1,900 miles.
Wow. Okay. And when you mean scanner, how big is this thing? How does it scan? We're not talking about something that you put in, right? Or like this is something like, it's almost like, I've seen the high-end scanners. I'm assuming it's something.
It's about that long. And
Okay.
then about that tall, and then I'm looking at it right now next to me, it's just a high-end 11 by 17 inch scanner. I scan modern size and Silver Age and Golden Age size art. If they're larger, I do them in multiple scans so I can piece them together in Photoshop. And sometimes it's even larger. I mean, for instance, I did a scanning trip recently. I saw Paul Smith and I scanned.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited for that.
There's going to be several books, not just one.
Okay.
And
okay.
Some of the art, he had several Doctor Strange stories. The first book is going to be X-Men, Paul Smith's Uncanny X-Men.
Yeah.
It's out on Amazon right now, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the pages he drew twice up, but very large, and I had to make them into, I had to do 3 scans to stitch them together on each page.
Wow. And then
although most of the pages were smaller, they fit on the 1217 scanner.
And I assume you use some kind of, you don't have to go into detail, but Photoshop or After Effects, something to
Photoshop
stitch everything together for a final product. Oh my gosh, that's awesome. With the first book, with the Rocketeer, let's go back to the beginning a little bit, and then we'll talk about these new books that you have coming out really quick. Was any of it your original art, so you could show exactly, like, get an idea, give people an idea of what you want?
Oh yeah, I presented it
Mm-hmm.
by scanning art and then showing what it would look like. I didn't own any of the Dave Stevens stuff. That was pretty much all owned by Dave Stevens' family, as well as collectors and people that he had either sold or given pages to over the years. But the vast majority was with the family.
And why start with that particular one? Is it you were a fan, or is that something that
it was a combination of things. One, most of the original art was together, and I had the help of one of the advisors. Actually, there were two advisors for the Rocketeer estate. The estate is handled by Jennifer Bacum, Dave's sister now. It used to be handled by Dave's mom, who sadly passed away a number of years ago. She was a wonderful woman, and Jennifer's a great person too. But David Mandel and Kelvin Mao were intimately involved with and very close friends with Dave, and so they were instrumental in the Rocketeer as an artist edition, and before that as a collected edition coming to IDW. And one of the reasons, excuse me, one of the reasons that made it, besides the fact that they had access to all the art, it was just much easier to work with a small place. DC and Marvel are great, but they're big corporations. And then once I did that book, it made my life a lot easier because I was able to send out copies to Marvel and DC and other artists, and they were like, "Oh yeah, we want to do this." And so my second book was Walter Simonson's The Mighty Thor. And then my third book was Wally Wood's EC Stories. I've been a lifelong, literally since I was 10 years old, and I saw reprints or 9 years old of East Coast Comics version of EC Comics. I was a fan of EC, and so doing Dave Stevens, Walter Simonson, and Wally Wood as the first three books were, it was tremendous for me.
That must have been a dream. That's so awesome. That is so cool. And all of it coming together, right? Like full circle from the moment you were 9 years old looking at original art, and now being able to put it together for a book, and now all these artists are interested in doing this. It's so cool. So you have some upcoming projects. Let's talk about those. You have a book that just came out in January, or is coming out, and this one's really interesting because of
came out 2 days ago.
Okay, so tell me about this one. This is the Spider-Man newspaper strips. Is that correct?
Yeah, John Romita's The Amazing Spider-Man newspaper strips. And there were a number of people in. So I was a comic art dealer before I was an editor, and a lot of my closest friends are art dealers. And there's one gentleman who I actually sold him his first original art back in the 80s, named Mike Berkey, and he has a website called Romita Man, and he's known for being a huge Spider-Man fan, and especially a Romita fan. And so Mike has been very helpful in a number of different books that I've done, but he had every one of those strips that's in the book came from Mike's collection. And
wow.
And we actually met up in Las Vegas a year ago, literally 1 year ago. And he brought all of these strips in suitcases. And while he and his brothers were betting on football, I was in my hotel room scanning the art.
I don't know who had a better time, Scott.
Mike did.
Okay.
No doubt about it. It was a lot of strips. I mean, we're talking about a lot of strips I scanned.
And on average, how this has to be a hard decision. How do you determine how big a book is and what gets left out, and if it's enough to make a second book? How does that come about?
I just kind of make it up. I mean, it's sort of what feels right. I mean, I have enough daily strips now from that trip to do a second book. If this one sells well, I'll do a second one.
Okay. So let's talk about your next book, one that I'm very, very, very excited for when it was announced and teased. And I think Paul Smith actually made a social media post about his art being scanned, and everybody assumed it was going to be an artist edition. So with somebody like Paul Smith, who's been around for a while and probably, to a lot of people, top tier X-Men artist, even though he only did about, oh my goodness, 9 issues, I think.
He did 10 issues
10
plus
issues.
he did that's of his original run.
Oh, and then X-Men and Alpha Flight and
2 issues of X-Men Alpha Flight, and then he also did sorted things over the years. He did a couple of issues of X-Men, Ultimate X-Men, things like that.
So with somebody like that, that is the next book that's coming, right? The Paul Smith. Oh, no. Okay.
That's coming out in about a year, or not, about 10 months. Okay. The next book that's coming out is Chris Samnee's Black Widow Artist Edition, which collects the first 6 issues that Chris co-wrote with Mark Waid and then drew pencils and inks. So that book will contain the first 6 issues plus all the layouts.
Wow. And that's the next book. And when does that one come out? Is that in
late March?
March. Okay.
Yeah, that's been done for, I don't know, 6 months. Oh, yeah, no, not 6 months, about 3 months.
Okay. So how long is the process then on something? Let's just use, I know, well, I guess everything is different, right? You're not always traveling to Vegas, or you're not.
Well, on that particular book, all the scans were done, and they were also all done on the previous book, because I did a Daredevil Chris Samnee book, and Chris's wife did the scanning, and we went back and forth. Chris has a good scanner, and we went back and forth on the settings, and Chris's wife Laura did a fantastic job.
Okay. So this has to be an amazing process to see too. When people so you're still reaching out, I assume, and then people reach out to you and saying, "Hey, Scott, I really like what you did with Todd McFarlane's Spider-Man. You interested in doing some of my art?" Or is it still you mainly reaching out?
It's pretty much me reaching out, and I do occasionally have artists reaching out to me to ask if I would be interested in doing some of their work, and honestly, just depends on the artist.
Okay. And do you tend to go with artists you grew up with first, or because you've seen to be you worked in the industry for such a long and you've seen all kinds of art, and well, I mean, Chris has been around for a little bit. I was going to say he's more of a modern artist, but
he is, and I consider Chris a new artist.
Okay.
I mean, my love of comic art is, Jack Kirby. I was a big fan of Commandy before I got into his older work, because when Commandy came out, I was 8 years old. Same thing with Joe Kubert. My first exposure to Kubert was on his Tarzan run, again, when I was 9 years old. Walter Simonson's Manhunter. That's still to this day my favorite specific series ever done. And that was when I was 10 years old. So, I mean, it's really true. The golden age of comics is when you're, 10, 11 years old.
Said it.
And so, but I also had a love of a lot of other things. So I was exposed, for better or worse, to underground comics when I was about 9 years old, and
Yeah.
I love undergrounds, and I love Mad artists. I love the EC stuff. Will Eisner's Spirit. So I was able to luckily do a bunch of books on some of my absolute favorite stuff. But at this point, I've done, I'm not sure, maybe 90 books, and so it's I need to sort of branch out. So we're going to be doing, for instance, a Tradmore book, and
Oh, okay.
yeah, and that'll be sometime in the next couple of years.
Wait,
Felix Liu was instrumental in that. He showed me Trad's work. I wasn't familiar with it, and I was blown away by it.
oh my gosh, that man is insane. Like, just the dynamic styles and the posing and so. Well, I guess my next question is, when you're working on somebody, let's say Tradmore, who has worked at Image and who has worked at Marvel Comics, are you allowed to mix and match if it's a particular artist, or do you have to stick with Tradmore's Marvel Comics or Tradmore's Luther Strode?
I can't mix and match. So, for instance,
Okay.
if I do a Marvel book, it's got to be Marvel. If I do a DC book, it's got to be DC. For instance, when I did the Marvel Covers book, the second one, I wanted to include the cover of Superman, Spider-Man.
It's a great cover.
But neither company would let me do it because, it's Superman and Spider-Man.
Yeah.
So yeah, I and that's totally fair. I mean, they own that material. They don't own the rights to Marvel material or DC material, depending on the book I'm doing. Occasionally, there are exceptions on, for instance, on the Bernie Wrightson DC book, 2 places let me use work that Wrightson did outside of DC, and DC was agreeable, which I, to this day, am very grateful for. And that was, there was a Wrightson piece of the EC Crypt Keepers, and Kathy Gaines Mifsud, who is in control of all the EC material, allowed me to put that in there. And then Condé Nast allowed me to put in a Wrightson shadow piece that was an advertisement that ran in the back of comics in 1972 when he was originally slated to be the artist on the shadow. And DC was very agreeable to that, as long as I got paperwork saying that they could do it.
One of the most common questions I get from anybody that is watching my video and had no idea these books were around is how is it that this is Marvel material and soon to be DC stuff too? Very, very cool for that Batman Year One. I cannot wait for that. And published by IDW. That seems to be a very common question that I get, and it's because it's the original art, and they ask, well, isn't the original art owned by said company?
Sure. The original art isn't owned. The original art isn't owned by the company. The IP is owned by the company. So okay. The artists own the actual original art, and it's been sold over the years. Blah blah blah.
Mm-hmm.
And when I do a book, I don't do a book unless the artist or the artist family is on board with it. So, for instance, Jack Kirby's family has been very supportive, and any number of different artist families who've passed away have been very supportive, whether it's John Buscema or Gene Colan's family or whomever.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes down to it, we can't do it unless Marvel agrees to let us do it, and they license it to us. Marvel, DC, the EC estate, Edgar Rice Burroughs, for instance, with the Tarzan books. They're all very supportive, and they like the books. Marvel. There's a friend of mine named Sven Larson who's at Marvel, and he's my main contact over there, and Sven's great. He's a big fan of this stuff, and working with somebody like that who's a big fan just makes my life so much easier.
Have you ever been told no by the family? You don't have to say who.
Oh yeah, of course. I've reached out to a number of different folks who weren't interested. I've reached out to Atomo's people. I wanted to do an Akira book, and
my gosh. Katsuhiro Otomo's Akira. That I was about to ask about things like that.
Well, they seemed interested, and they asked for some specific books, and then we sent them like 3 or 4 books, and then we never heard back again. They totally blocked us, but it's kind of funny.
What?
But so
that would go ahead. I'm sorry.
So Mr. Otomo, if you want to have an artist edition, just reach out. I'm on Facebook.
I'll have my people call his people.
I would love that. I would love that. The same thing.
You get to fly to Japan and scan these things. That would make it well worth it. That would be awesome.
It's not as much fun though lugging a scanner as you might.
Although the scanner would be. You need an intern. That's what you need, Scott.
I have an assistant, Nick Nino, and he's a great guy. But I am, when it comes to this stuff, I've had other people scan stuff for me, and with the exception of one person who used to work at IDW, Rebecca Callahan, I'm sort of a control freak. I'm very concerned with the quality and very concerned with how things are scanned, because it's not just the scan, but making sure that it fits properly and that all the art is there. And so I've had too many problems when I've had other people scan stuff where I've had to basically redo it. And if there's a problem, I'd rather be able to just blame myself than, blame somebody else. But 2 other people who I've reached out to, their families, and they just turned me down. One was the Hergé estate. And the other was because they have, a ton of Hergé Tintin art. And then Mobius's family, and they also weren't interested.
Wow. Maybe I shouldn't have asked that question, because that's just breaking my heart. All of these, they would make wonderful artist editions.
There's just so many I can do in my lifetime, though. I've done 90 books, so you
still got a long way to go, Scott. You still got a lot. You just cracked the door open with some So tell me about the upcoming. I'm not sure if there's even a release date yet, but it's one of my most anticipated books and a lot of people's, and that is the Batman book.
Which one?
Year One.
I'm kidding. That is that's coming out Greg actually just messaged me. It's July 16th. It was going to be July 2nd, but we had to delay it for a couple of weeks, so it'll be out on July 16th. I am going to be Chip Kidd is designing that book, world-renowned designer, and
big fan of his work.
Oh yeah, no, and he's a big fan. He actually asked me if he could design this book, which was very nice. And so I'm expecting the first PDF on that at the end of this month, and I'll turn it into DC to get their approval, and then it's going to approve to print in mid-February, and then it'll be out unless there are any problems in printing, which especially nowadays, books seem to be getting delayed a lot. But the plan is for it to be out before San Diego Con.
When running into these original, we'll use Batman since that's one that's coming out later on. When running into these particular collectors that have these pages, do you luck out and find somebody that has 2 whole issues?
Oh yeah, all the time.
Gosh, awesome.
With Batman Year One, David had all the originals, so he never sold them. And same thing with Walter Simonson. Walter keeps all of his original art with occasional exceptions. but so, with the recently released Fantastic Four artist edition, Walter Simonson's Fantastic Four, I went to the Baltimore Comic Con a little over a year ago in September or October, I think it was, and Walter brought down all the art, and I scanned them at the show. And also, while I was at the show, I scanned other art for other books.
So you're constantly working when everybody else is going out there and having a good time. You're just scanning and talking to people about scanning.
But that's more fun. I mean, like when I'm in a hotel room, it's not as much fun. If I'm at a convention like Baltimore or San Diego or someplace like that, or New York Comic Con, and I'm scanning art at the booth, then that's actually a lot of fun because I get to talk to people, and people are excited about the art. So that's a lot of fun. I mean, definitely beats being in a Las Vegas hotel room watching CNN, or something.
That's true. Yeah, I would love to see the process of the scans. I think it's amazing what you do.
And to expand on your question a little bit, it depends on the book. I mean, there was one person who I went to visit who had a huge collection of art, and while I was there scanning something completely different, he said, "Oh, are you interested in scanning this?" And he had 6 complete issues of an artist that wound up being a book. Just he had it, I scanned it, a year later it was an artist edition.
What do you remember what it was?
I do, but I'd rather not say because I like to keep
gotcha.
I like to keep who has art confidential, and people might be able to figure it out.
When doing the scanning, how long is that process for a single page?
70 seconds.
Man, that's a quick scan. We have come far in scanning
capabilities. I remember one time there's new software that makes it very easy to scan. And in the old days, like 10, 11 years ago, I remember I went to St. Louis, and it was a 3-day trip, and I scanned 400 pages, but they were all twice up pages, which means I had to do 800 scans. And on that particular trip, I was there for 3 days, and between me and I mentioned Rebecca earlier, Rebecca and we literally had 3 hotel rooms, one for her, one for me, and then one in the middle that was sort of the scanning room. And we had 2 scanners, and we were going, probably a total of 16 hours a day. And that's because back then it took 4 to 6 minutes on a single scan. So 4 to 6 minutes, 800, do the math. That's a lot of time. Whereas now with 70 seconds a scan, it's a lot faster. Thank God.
Yeah, that saves you some time. Wow, you must have had a lot of patience too. You're a very patient man to be doing these type of tasks.
My old pal Darwin Cook said that I was tenacious.
He was a wise man. So, do you have anything else lined up? You don't have to go into specifics as far as Batman or DC in general.
Well, I have 2 DC books that are coming out this year. The Batman Year One by Mazzucchelli, which will also include all of Mazzucchelli's layouts for the series as well.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And the second book I'm doing, the second DC book I'm doing this year is Neil Adams' DC Legends. And it's going to be a big book. It's going to be 232 pages with 4 foldouts. And I have I have a ton of Neil Adams stuff. If anybody who's out there is a Neil Adams fan, it's going to be a ridiculous book. It's going to have 7 complete stories, including a Batman story, a Dead Man story, a Green Lantern story, a Private Life of Clark Kent story that is one of my favorite short stories, an El Diablo 4-pager that is inked by Bernie Wrightson, and 2 of the best mystery stories, including one that's entirely in pencil. And besides that, there'll be about 60 different covers. And I don't mean to brag, but I think I have almost all of Neil's best covers. I'm missing some really great ones, but I think I have nearly all of his best ones. I have Batman 232, which is the first appearance of Ra's al Ghul. I have Detective 400, which is the first appearance of Man-Bat. Green Lantern 76, which is the first Green Lantern Green Arrow cover. Green Lantern 85, which is the My Ward is a Junkie cover. Superman 233, which is the Kryptonite No More cover. I have the Flying Heroes cover from Superman 252. I have the Joker's 5-Way Revenge cover, which is Batman 251. And don't ask me how I remember all these numbers. So I've got a lot of great stuff in this book. And at this point, I have more than 350 pieces of original art by Neil. So I'm going through the process now of culling it down so I can fit what is the best into that book.
Unless there's a volume 2.
I thought about splitting into 2, but honestly, if you're a Beatles fan, the White Album, White Album was a really good album. If it was made into one album, it could have been their best album. So this is going to be a really good book.
Wow. Do you have a dream project? Like something that you would like to do in the future that either you've been turned down before and would love to go and revisit, like something that you're just like, oh, I would love to see this particular artist edition?
Yeah, of course, but there are some books that are just impossible to do. Like, if I had one particular, if I could do any book, if I could get the art, I'd want to do a Plastic Man book by Jack Cole. But that stuff just doesn't exist. I've seen a handful of pages of Cole's Plastic Man work, and there are a bunch of different books that I have planned in the future that I'm going to do. Some of them are in that category, but I've been very lucky. I mean, I've done Dave Stevens' Rocketeer. I've done Walter Simonson's Manhunter. I'm about to do David Mazzucchelli's Batman Year One. I did do David Mazzucchelli's Born Again, Daredevil. There's so much stuff. I did that Don Rosa book. I did a bunch of EC books, which is my favorite stuff. I did Joe Kubert's Tarzan. So I did Walter Simonson's Manhunter. So I've actually done so many things that I truly love. It's, and now doing Neil Adams and Batman Year One, those are definitely 2 important things for me personally. And also, it's a little bit later. I was a little bit older, but, Paul Smith's X-Men, that's another one that really, besides the fact that I loved Paul's work on that, I've known him, for probably 40 years, and he's a really good guy. And I'm excited that I'm working on that. I'm actually working on that book. I have open on my screen pages that I'm working on that particular book, because that's going to the printer in May.
Oh, yeah? You got it open on your screen right now?
Yeah. Can I share?
Yeah, as long as I get the thumbs up from Gray.
Oh, he won't care.
Okay. Yeah, you can share your screen.
Actually, you know what? I'm going to close this particular one because it's the Doctor Strange page.
Sure.
I'm actually working on Doctor Strange stuff, which is not going to be until another year or so out from the X-Men book, or maybe later.
First it's X-Men, and then it's Paul Smith Marvel comics?
Well, it's the first book is Uncanny X-Men.
Okay.
So I'll tell you what. Let me open up my. And I have all 10 of Paul Smith's X-Men covers.
Oh,
Main covers. So do you have a favorite one you want to see? How about, you know what?
168 is my first comic book, like the first comic book I ever got.
Okay, hold on a second.
Who owns that cover? Oh man, this is exciting.
They're big files, so it's taking some time to open. Sorry about that.
No, you're okay. You're doing a stream and you're showing the art, so it's going to cost some slowing down.
How do I share?
If you go down to the bottom, there's a present button.
Okay.
And when you click on present, you can share screen. And then when you share the screen, you can click on window or entire screen or Chrome tab. But you can just click on the window. It's the easiest way.
Okay, hold on a second.
Then I think I have to give permission or something is the way that these usually work.
Hold on a second.
Sure, take your time.
Do you see it?
No, not yet.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, so go to present, share screen, and it's just me now. So I think he got himself out. So we'll just wait for him to come back. He can just rejoin by using the same link. Let me just message Greg. There he is.
Okay, so I'm going to go to present again and then share screen.
Yes, sir. And you can, up at the top, there's a Chrome tab, window, or entire screen. I would suggest using window. That way you can just share the window instead of, so we don't have to see all your tabs.
I don't see it. It says screen sharing tips, share screen, share screen.
You have to click on the actual screen, I think. Like you click on it, you highlight it, and then you hit share down at the bottom.
Yeah, this isn't working. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
It's a beautiful cover.
I will get to see it. I will get to see it soon enough. Yeah. So with Paul Smith's, you're saying that's going to be a couple of books because you have enough original art to have one that's Uncanny X-Men and then one that's going to be Marvel.
Doctor Strange.
Doctor Strange. Okay.
Yeah, and I have 4 complete Doctor Strange stories, and then besides that, I also have a lot of other things. Like I have his very first Marvel story, which is from Marvel Fanfare #1, a 10-page Daredevil story. That'll be in that book. And then a bunch of other things. And then there'll be a third Paul Smith book also.
Oh, wow.
That'll be Leave It to Chance.
Oh, one of my favorite, most underrated series.
Yeah, it's a great series.
I guess that's DC now because it was Wildstorm.
It was always creator owned.
Well,
and
yeah.
And then it went to Image. And then and it hasn't been published in years, and it's just great stuff.
No, I don't know why we haven't had a reprint of that in a hardcover format, especially when you're talking about the creators behind that book.
Well, actually, there was a hardcover that Image put out. They put out 3 of them, but that's more than 10 years ago.
It's been a while. It's been a long time.
Yeah.
So I was about to ask about things like manga, and then we're gonna get to some chat questions because there's some really good ones. Things like manga, if you had ever thought about it, but you answered my question long before I could even ask it with Katsuhiro Otomo. So you did get a reply from them saying, "Yeah, we're interested."
Yeah, but then they didn't reply after that. I sent them some books, and they I sent them several emails, and never heard back. That's too bad. I mean, it would be it would be a great series of books.
Mm-hmm. So there was a Bernie Wrightson Frankenstein artist edition that you
No,
have been working on.
I've been working on it. Yeah.
Okay. I'm sure these things take time, right? This I assume it's like books too. Like there's something sometimes, like a project gets dropped on your lap, and you're like, "Ooh, yeah, let's actually let's do that first, and we'll
Oh,
move
sure,
this."
sure. I mean, the Wrightson book, to be quite honest, I'm sort of intimidated by it because I only have one shot, and Wrightson's Frankenstein is really considered one of the pinnacles of comic art. So I expect that to come out sometime in mid 2025.
Okay. This is a interesting question. Scott, I know your story about meeting Jack Kirby on the Corner Box podcast. And you still have all the sketches from artists you got back then. That stuff was wild hearing today. So you got to meet Jack Kirby? Is that what he's asking?
Yeah, well, I did a podcast that went live this week.
Okay.
My pals John Barber and David Hedgecock.
I've interviewed John. He's a good guy.
Yeah, he is.
Fan of his.
Yeah, they're both good people. So do you want me to tell that story and how I met Jack Kirby, or?
Sure, I'm curious about these sketches from artists you got back then.
Well, it was a much different world back when I was a kid. I mean, between the ages of like 12 and 17, I would occasionally call up artists because artists had listed phone numbers. And there wasn't any email or anything like that. So I would call up different folks, Alex Toth, Jack Kamen, Al Feldstein, Harvey Kurtzman, a bunch of people. And, they were all very nice and kind, and they sent me sketches in the mail. Mm-hmm. When I was 15 or 16, I moved to California. After 10th grade, my mom decided to move to California. I wasn't very happy about it because I, was going to miss all my friends. But I found a comic shop called Fantasy Castle, which was I lived in Woodland Hills, and this shop was in, I think, Tarzana, which is like one or two towns over in the San Fernando Valley. And I worked at a deli called Solly's. And I would basically worked there. I didn't have a lot of friends because we had just moved there. And so I just threw myself into my work. I threw myself into collecting, but I needed to make money to collect. So I had a full-time job at this deli, and I worked there after school 5 days a week. I worked from, school would get out at, I think, 1:50, and I would I would take the bus to work, and I would work from 3 to 11, and my mom would pick me up at night.
Okay.
And so there was this comic shop called Fantasy Castle, and I remember I used to go there, and I went there one time, and I, was buying a bunch of different Jack Kirby comics, some Commandees to fill in my collection, probably some Avengers, probably like 8 or 9 different comics. Excuse me. And so when I went to the register, the guy behind the counter, and it's funny, to this day it seems really odd to me, but the guy said, "Oh, do you like Jack Kirby?" I've got like 8 or 9 comics that I'm buying. And I said, "Oh yeah, sure, I love Jack Kirby." And he just says to me, no idea why, he said, "Well, he lives around here and he has a listed phone number." And
man.
I wish I could find that guy because I would thank him. So I went home and I called 411 directory assistance. Mm-hmm. And sure enough, Jack Kirby had a listed phone number. And so I called him up and I said, "Hi, can I speak to Jack Kirby?" And, this guy on the other end goes, "I'm Jack Kirby." And we just talked for like 20 minutes, and he was great. He answered a bunch of different questions for me. You could tell he really enjoyed talking to a fan. And so I I didn't even have a chance to ask him for a sketch because, we were just talking about comics and all this stuff. Um, and so then he asked me where I lived, and I told him, and he said, "Oh, that's not too far from here. Why don't you get your mom to drive you up here this weekend and bring some comics, and I'll sign them, and we could have lunch." So
Wow.
my mom, God bless her, she drove me up that weekend, and I remember Jack's wife Roz. Her and my mom sat in the kitchen and drank coffee and smoked cigarettes, or at least my mom smoked cigarettes. I don't remember if Roz did. And Jack and I spoke for Mr. Kirby, and I spoke for a couple hours, and he signed a bunch of my comics. And it was funny. I remember I brought a bag of comics, and I brought way too many. I didn't understand, comic book etiquette. And so I brought probably like 50 comics. And I remember Roz, as I was taking them out, was rolling her eyes. And I didn't understand why until years later.
You were that guy at the comic book convention in the line.
But he signed every single one of my comics. And then we had lunch in their kitchen, which was, his studio was in his living room, facing out on their pool, facing out onto this amazing view. They were on top of a hill in Thousand Oaks, California. And so at the end of the day, Mr. Kirby gave me a portfolio of, he did a thing called the Gods portfolio in the early 70s or late 60s. I don't remember which. And he gave me that, and he did a sketch of Captain America waving, saying, "Hi, Scott," which actually, hang on a minute. Yeah, it's on my screen, but I can't, on my phone, but I can't really figure out how to show it to you. Anyway.
Where do you keep it?
What's that?
Where do you keep it?
It's literally on the other side of that wall on the stairwell.
That's got to be like your prized possession, and you own a lot of cool things, but
it's certainly one of them. Yeah,
there's a really good story to go with that. I've always heard about these stories about Jack. I have a good friend of mine who's passed away now. He was a big comic book dealer, and he had been to Jack's house a few times, and I don't know how it was when you went there. He would have been, well, I'm not gonna assume he was a little bit older. He would have been about 80 now. No, 85 now. He he was talking about when he went there, like there were all these original pieces of art just like laying around. It was just crazy. He was just in awe because he always thought, that artists would put their original art and put in safe places, but he was like, no, some of the stuff was just laying on the floor, and it was just crazy.
Well, it was also a different time. I mean, there wasn't the value associated. Another thing about Jack Kirby, though, because I cannot stress enough how wonderful a guy he was, and also there's no doubt in my mind when people talk about the most important artist in comic history, there's only one. It's Jack Kirby. The most important artist in comics history. We would not have comic books today, at least not in the way we do, if it wasn't for Jack Kirby. And that's not an opinion. That's a fact. And I'll be happy to argue with anybody on that. But more importantly, he was a good person, and the story that I told about going to his house, that is not a unique story. He used to do that all the time. I mean, I hear that story over and over saying, "Oh yeah, that happened to me," and it's remarkable. I mean, the guy was just, if it wasn't for me going there, my life would not have been the same. I mean, I can point to that one moment where I think that changed my life.
Now people just get excited when an artist or a writer likes their tweet.
It's a different time. That's okay.
It is different times, and just seems like definitely a different era of days gone by. How many? You said you've done 90 books.
I think so. I mean, I actually rely on Scott from aeindex.org, and he told me I've done 90, so I'll take his word for it. He knows what I do better than I do. And if you don't, if your viewers aren't familiar with it, it's aeindex.org. And it is the best site on the web for artist editions, and not just IDW, but any. He keeps track of every artist edition that comes out, from Graffiti to Dark Horse to Apex. Great site, very valuable.
Hold on. Those of us that sometimes can't afford artist editions need more artisan editions. So what makes that process to go from hardcover to soft cover? You all just choose like the most popular books or the biggest sellers to put into soft cover?
I mean, it's kind of there isn't really a formula. It's people at the office will sometimes make suggestions, or I'll say let's do it. But in response, though, to the comment, I know $150 can be daunting, but if you think about it in comparison to the original art, I mean, the Neil Adams book that's coming out in September, that the originals in that book would, and this is no hyperbole, the original art in that book would be $50 million. So, I mean, a couple of covers in that book have gone for more than $500,000 each. So,
well, that definitely goes into my next question then. Yeah, you've scanned some pretty expensive stuff.
Yeah.
How are you being watched by the owner at all times, like making sure there's no dents or nothing happens to their stuff?
Well, okay, here's the thing. A lot of times people will, like, about a little over a year ago, I went to Los Angeles on a scanning trip, and I met up with several people, and they would come over to my hotel and they would just drop off the art and then come back several hours later or the next day. One guy had a collection of about 600 pages, and he just dropped them off and came back 3 days later. Or actually, I think I drove him back to his house that he lives in LA. But one of the reasons that I'm kind of uniquely suited for doing this kind of project is, not only do I know who has most of this art, or if I don't, I know somebody who does. Okay. But I also have known these people for sometimes decades. I mean, I mentioned Mike Berkey before, but one of my best friends is a guy named Albert Moy, and Albert is probably the premier comic art dealer out there of the kind of stuff that I like. The guy has just remarkable pieces of art in both as a dealer and as a collector. And I've known him since he was 17 and I was 18. And so many of the people I deal with who will leave art with me, like Mike Berkey leaving all those Spider-Man strips in my hotel room, or Albert Moy, or the guy in Los Angeles. These are people I've known for decades and who trust me. So it makes it a little bit easier for me than it would for somebody else who would say, hey, I should do this.
Like me calling somebody up and going, hey, I have a scanner in the back of my car. Use that original art.
Well, it's a little bit
different. You go gamble for a couple of hours and leave me with your original art.
But also the other thing is, I'm working for a company, IDW, that is very good at dealing with the intricacies of licensing. So, doing stuff with Marvel, doing stuff with DC, EC, all these different people. It makes it easier.
You have a lot of praises in the comments right now, talking about some of the favorite books that you have put out over the last few years.
Yeah,
And
I can't see the questions. What are they?
this one right here is talking about. Oh, they're just praising your work. I was just highlighting some of them. But this
Tell them to go and vote in the Dunbier Awards that are up now at aeindex.org.
There's Dunbier Awards. That's awesome.
You know what? It's kind of embarrassing, but I still really dig it. You know, it's kind of funny, and more importantly, my wife thinks it's really cool.
Okay, well, that's the important thing.
But they run from January 1st to January 31st. So if you go there, you can do it.
I will have to go and check it out myself. My all-time favorite artist themed collection from IDW is the Danger Girl Gallery Edition with Jeffrey Scott Campbell, as well as the 7-issue series itself. It's fun, light entertainment comics.
I love that. I'm actually in that series.
What's that?
I'm actually in that series.
You're drawn in the series? You appear? Scott appear?
I appear in several issues as sort of just a secondary character, including page 1 of issue number 1.
That's awesome. Now you're forever immortalized. Not that you weren't before with all your work you've done, but there's a big difference in being immortalized in comics. When deciding projects, do you try to do a mix of subjects and ages, like how old the project is? That is a good question. Like, you try to do something modern, like we talked about Chris Samney, like you still consider him a modern artist, and then go back to something a little bit older, or it's just things that
it's just stuff that I like. You know, I mean, literally, I mean, it doesn't matter when a series is drawn. I mean, you know, honestly, if you look at, I'll give you an example of one of the best drawn series I've seen in years, and that's Mark Silvestri's new Batman series. That thing is crazy good.
He's my favorite artist of all time.
Yeah, and I'm hoping at some point in the next 2 or 3 years, maybe we'll get to do that.
That would be cool. Do you ever run across artists that you've reached out to and they're like, "Oh man, I moved on to a tablet. I do digital art now." Has that happened?
You know, there are guys who do that. You know, there are artists who do that, and that's fine. You know, it's just a different tool. I prefer art you can hold, but to each their own.
Yes, sir. Taylor Talks Comics he's a big fan of yours. The Indiana Jones of original comic art.
Thank you. I take that as a compliment. Thank you very much.
It's a big compliment. Let's see. Would IDW ever consider possibly remastering some Vertigo classics that have long deserved such royal treatment? Would DC consider it as well?
You know, DC would definitely consider it. I'm not sure. Well, I mean, Bob Chapman at Graffiti Designs did do a Sandman artist edition that was very nice. Bob probably. What's that?
Wasn't it Overture that they did?
They did Overture, but they also did Sandman. They also did the early stuff. Sam Keith, Kelly Jones.
Oh wow,
all those guys.
And let's see here. I'm talking about the Neil Adams book. And this is let me see if I can please tell the marketing staff at IDW let buyers know about upcoming variants. The website can sometimes be tough when you search for books. Most of the variants end up on eBay.
Greg, are you listening? Sorry, that's not me.
I do need to get with Greg a little bit after this interview to talk about because people have asked me about reprints. Like, how does that work? Because there have been so many that they've missed and they just started getting into these. But I think IDW has been doing a really good job of bringing a lot of these that were long. Website is undergoing updates right now, so that's what's going on. There have been so many that have been out of print for years, so you can't do them all, right? So they pick and choose some of the best ones.
What are you talking about? Artist editions in particular, or
yes, editions that are out of print.
I guess it depends on which ones are the most sought after. Like one of the ones that I've been asked to reprint for years is David Mazzucchelli's Daredevil Born Again, and we are going to be doing a reprint of that next year. We've done an artisan edition of it, but we are going to do a full-on, full-size new printing of that artist edition, and that's a great book. I mean, Mazzucchelli and Miller, what a great.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
And then we just came out with the John Byrne X-Men artist edition, and we are going to be coming out again with Dave Cockrum's.
Oh yes.
X-Men. So we have a bunch of things planned.
I'm excited about that one because the John Byrne one was the one that when I got the Jim Lee one. This is the John Byrne one. When I got the Jim Lee one, I was like, oh well, let's see what other X-Men artist editions there are. And I noticed that John Byrne was out of print, and I was like, oh man. Well, if I find it, it was meant to be. But then they decided to re-release it, so I'm really happy about that. Dave Cockrum's was another one that was out of print. And let's see here. The work done on John Buscema's Marvel Heroes Oversized Artist Edition is remarkable. On my coffee table, and I read it all the time.
Thank you.
These are beautiful books. And here is the link to the Dunbier Award, by the way. Thank you for that, James.
Oh my God, I'm sorry.
No, I'm curious about what's on there.
It's not just my books. It's pretty much any artist edition that is done during the calendar year is up for can be voted on. This year, I think there were 6 books, and 3 of them are mine.
Oh, interesting. Has anyone asked about the Artist Select line? Is it dead, or is there hope for any new Artist Select books? There you go, Bang Shrimpster. And if you're driving and just listening, I think Scott means it's dead.
That just to clarify, that actually wasn't my project. Mm-hmm. That was done by Chris Ryle, who is the former editor-in-chief and then also former publisher of IDW, really good guy. When Chris left, I wound up doing two Artist Select books. One was just finishing up his last book, which was a John Byrne one, and literally the only one that I worked on from beginning to finish was an Artist Select of Stan Sakai's Grass Cutter, and that was a lot of fun to do. Stan Sakai was, so I miss him. He was so much fun to work with, such a good guy, so talented, so nice.
Has there been an artist edition someone else did that you've seen and you wish you did it?
Oh, sure. The ones that it's funny, probably from Bob Chapman at Graffiti, because Ronin is one of my favorite artist editions that I haven't done. The Dark Knight one is good. The Kelly Jones books. And also the Sam Keith book. That one in particular, because I edited that book as a comic. So I really would have liked to have done it as an artist edition, but that's all right.
Are you the character Duncan in Danger Girl issue 1, page 1, all 5 panels, wearing a Hawaiian shirt and glasses?
That's me.
That's awesome.
And actually, Jeff, J. Scott Campbell used to go by Jeff, and now he goes by Scott, but I still call him Jeff. Jeff surprised me with that. He did that page, and the woman serving me the drink and the pineapple, or serving me the drink, and I have the pineapple. That's supposed to be Salma Hayek, but I always kid Jeff. He and I have different views on women's proportions. She's a little bit skinny for Salma, but she still, she looks great. I mean, Jeff is one of those guys who is a fantastic artist, and unfortunately, he's wound up just becoming a cover artist over the last 5-10 years. But he is such a talented storyteller. I mean, it's funny. His main inspiration, he has a couple of inspirations. Mort Drucker was his earliest inspiration, then Art Adams. But one thing, and you'll be able to see it if you look at his work again. He's usually influenced by Disney animated films.
I have a long history with Jeffrey Scott Campbell.
Oh yeah,
I lost out to that guy in a
contest.
The contest at yes, Nintendo Power Magazine.
Right.
He beat me out, and I was like, "Oh, this art isn't that good."
Well, the first time I ever saw his art, like I said, Jim Lee used to show me comic art, and I lived in New York, and he sent me faxes of Jeff's stuff going, "You got to see this. This guy's great." And then he sent it to me, and I famously said, "Yeah, I don't know. I don't see what you see in this guy. It's not. I don't really like it." And I've been proven wrong many times over, and now I'm a big fan of his work.
I love hearing that.
He does too. He loves that story.
This is a good question. And as an old Silver Bronze Age fan, I'd be curious what IDW's, or I guess your Scott, thoughts are on our pal Sal Buscema.
Fine artist. Maybe at some point in the future, I'll do an artist edition, but it'll be a ways off. I've got a lot of books I'm planning on. I mean, I probably have 20, 25 books right now that I'm working on.
Yeah, gosh.
And I'm not working on all of them concurrently, but I have them that are in planning stages.
How many projects do you work on, like at the same time?
Let's see. Here's my list for. Okay, my list through June, and this is June to approve to print.
Okay.
John Romita's The Amazing Spider-Man Artisan Edition Volume 2. David Mazzucchelli's Batman Year 1. That's at the end of, or that's in mid February now. Dave Cockrum's X-Men is going to approve at the end of February. I'm doing an Eternals pencils and inks book, which means that on one page will be pencils and the other page will be inks of Jack Kirby's Eternals. Then doing a reprint of Jim Lee's DC Artist Edition. And then 2 months from now, 3 months, thank God. I'm approving the Neal Adams book. Then we have, we're doing a reprint of the Wally Wood EC book. That's in late April. And then in early May, Paul Smith X-Men. Anyway, I got a lot of books.
Yeah, it sounds like it. So can you give us a tease as to projects that are to come later on that haven't been announced without going into detail or anything? Like superhero, back to horror, back to Marvel, DC. You have anything lined up at DC besides the 2 Batman books, the Batman Neal Adams, or the Neal Adams book and the Batman Year 1?
Oh yeah. There's going to be and this is stuff that I've talked about a little bit. I don't think it's been officially announced, but we're doing a Garcia Lopez book, which I'm very excited about. I'm going to be doing not 1, but 2 DC covers books.
Okay.
And I've probably got 1,000 covers, so I'm going to have to cull that down a bit. I'm doing 2 George Perez books, 1 DC, 1 Marvel. Yeah. And what else am I doing?
Any more X-Men lined up? Seem to be you've got some of the big ones. Got Jim Lee, John Byrne, Dave Cockrum, Paul Smith. My goodness. Silvestri would be a good one.
I don't have enough scans of his stuff. It would still be years away before I could do a Mark Silvestri X-Men. You'll probably see, knock wood, a Mark Silvestri Batman book before that. So, but don't go and nobody please go up to Mark and bug him about it. It's all right now. Just we've talked a couple of times and that's it.
That's exciting. That's exciting. It sounds like you. Any more EC stuff? You seem to, since you're a big fan of that era too.
We're going to be doing some reprints. So the Wally Wood book is going to be out at the end of this year, and then it'll have 3 stories that were not in the original book.
So you're adding things.
Yeah,
that's it. That's
I don't do that too often, but with Wally Wood, he's Wally Wood. Wally Wood might be the greatest cartoonist of all time. Died at the age of 53.
Yeah.
Although there's an artist that maybe some of you people listening to haven't heard of, a guy named Joe Maneely. He was a wonderful artist at Marvel before Marvel became Marvel. He died at 32. He died in a tragic train accident. But,
he was the Black Knight artist, right?
That's him. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember, I don't know who else does this. I remember when I first saw his art, I was like, oh my gosh, why hasn't this guy done much more? He was amazing. And I remember looking him up, and I found out that he passed away at a young age in a train accident. It's crazy. He was a phenomenal artist.
Yeah. 32. Anyway, I mean that's like James Dean. Just people who've died way
too young. Yeah, agree. Pena Uncanny X-Force. Man, there's so many ideas you guys have. Oh, thank you, Josh. Oh, Paul Gulachi, Master Kung Fu Artist Edition. Thank you both for everything.
Is that one of the posters from the comic art fans? Not comic art fans, from the Artist Edition message boards? Because everybody there is asking me for Paul Gulachi also.
Really? They are? I was a big fan of his Master Kung Fu, so I don't know.
Maybe at some point, it's obviously it's great stuff, but I don't have enough to do a book. I'd have to really focus on and reach out to people, reach out to collectors who have a bunch of it. For instance, another book that I'm planning on doing in the future, or a couple of other books I'm planning on doing in the future that I almost have enough for this. Jim Aparo, Spectre, and Brave and the Bold. I have enough to do a book, and then I also want to do Alan Moore era Swamp Thing. So I have, and again, this is not, we don't have a contract with DC, but I've probably got enough to about half of a book right now of really great stuff, and that would be, in my head, it would be Bissett and Toddleben, but also Rick Veitch, Ron Randall, Sean McManus, any of those guys who did, just wonderful stuff from Alan Moore. I did something like that with America's Best Comics. I did an America's Best Comics artist edition of a variety of different artists who worked with Alan Moore.
That one sounds really awesome. Okay, so I have to ask, because I do not want to take up all your time. You being nice enough to give us some time.
No worries.
What is the number one book that you hear your fans or people in the boards or people ask you for? Like, now that they know what you do, as soon as they find out what you do, what's the pitch? What's the number one book they pitch? Oh, have you thought about this? Have you thought about this?
People are always very helpful and kind and make suggestions. There are a lot of different artists. I can't really pick out any one that someone asks for the most, but there are a lot. Sometimes people ask me, have you thought about this? And I'm like, oh yeah, I did that already. That actually happens more than you would think.
You've done 90 books, and I was like, oh, maybe he has done. The one that I thought of when Greg had reached out, I was like, I need to Google this first and make sure it's not a thing. And if it is, I need to find it. It was Arthur Adams, the the new Fantastic Four stuff. I love that because he's a big fan of kaiju, and he drew the Fantastic Four and the new Fantastic Four, like Wolverine and Ghost Rider. Oh my gosh, that stuff is amazing. So I was like, well, maybe they did that already. Okay, no, I'm okay. And it's not my pitch. I was just thinking, like, oh, that's definitely one of my childhood's like favorite stories when I was a kid. Yeah.
So you'd like to see an Art Adams book?
Yes, 100%, 110%.
Okay, I'll tell you what. We'll put it out in 2026.
Okay, I'll be here waiting for it.
Done deal.
Done deal. All right, virtual handshake. That was easy, Scott. Thank you for being here. That was the whole point of this interview.
Yeah, that's in our last, our most recent Marvel agreement.
Oh my gosh, that's awesome. Oh, love it.
I don't have enough to do it yet, but I'm getting close.
Oh, I'd pre-order more Swamp Thing Artist Edition right now if I could. So let me do a couple more of these and then call it a night. Have you ever thought about doing an artist edition on comic-based cartoon series like Alfred and Stimpy, Muppet Babies, Rocky, and Bullwinkle, Alvin and the Chipmunks? You have to throw Alpha in there, didn't you, James?
I can honestly say I have not.
I don't know if James is listening or not. That was great. I was just rambling, and yeah, Scott was just waiting. All right. Well, you've teased us with upcoming stuff. You've teased us with reprints. You've got the Spider-Man strips that just came out this week. And you've got the Chris Samney Black Widow book, which I'm very excited for because I love that Mark Waid story. And
remember, Chris and Mark co-wrote it, not just.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And it's the first 6 issues, right?
Yeah.
Excellent. Excellent.
And if it does well, we'll do the second 6.
Love hearing that. Well, Scott, thank you so much for your time. Seriously, this has been a pleasure getting to know you. And if ever you want to come back to talk about a specific project, or maybe if I see you at a con scanning, I'll come by and say hello and see if I can fill you.
Please do. Where are you based?
I'm in Kentucky, like Don Rosa.
Oh, that's right. You told me.
I don't grow chili peppers, but I do get out often, and I go to conventions. Cool. I do go to Baltimore. I'm planning on going back there, and also Heroes Con, and New York is a good one. So
I'll be at Baltimore again this year, and I run a charity art auction there for Hero Initiative, so I'll be doing that again in the fall.
You do that? Okay, well then I will definitely come by and say hi, or try to find you somewhere.
Yeah, we actually the last 2 years we raised more than $90,000 on each auction.
That is amazing. Seriously, Scott is doing amazing work. We should have sequential art sections in every museum, and Dunbier's artist editions should be within their libraries. Now that is awesome. And thank you, Scott. Can't wait for the ton of books that you teased. He teased a lot, and I like that. All right, everybody, smash that like button. Don't forget to go to the website to go and vote for the Dunbier 2024 book of the year. I know that James put it up here. Where is it? Here it is. The 2023 Dunbier Awards. You can go there. Thank you, James, for posting that. Thank you again, Greg, and everybody.
And just to give a shout out again to Scott's website, it's really, if you're interested in artist editions, you should check it out because it really is a great site, and it's truly a labor of love from that guy.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you all so much for watching. Stay healthy and safe out there, and make sure you tune into the channel for more of Scott's beautiful work that he puts together.
Thank you very much.
And that's a